Okay, let's get going. Good day to everyone who's joined us at our Women's Redesigning Food Systems, Food Thinkers seminars, webinars that we've been hosting at the Centre for Food Policy for a couple of years. It brings together big ideas from women in academia, policy, business and advocacy on redesigning food systems. And today I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Priya Fielding-Singh of the University of Utah in the United States to talk to us about how the other half eats, the untold story of food and inequality in America. I think the title of her new book. My name's Professor Corinna Hawkes. I'm director at the Centre for Food Policy, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this Food Thinkers. Before I introduce Priya, I'm going to mention a few things. If you'd like to receive our monthly newsletter, then please do put your name and email address into the chat function sending to the panelists so you can hear more about our future events. We always get inquiries after these events about our MSc in food policy, and so we'll also put the link in because applications are open to that too. And we're also very excited to say that we have an upcoming undergraduate program, which is new as well, in nutrition and food policy. This webinar has been recorded and we'll put it on our YouTube channel after the event. Now, the way it's going to run this evening is that Priya is going to talk to 40 minutes or so through her slides, and then it's going to be an open Q&A. And as always in these sessions, we invite critical questions, things that come to you that really you've reflected on as you've heard. This is called Food Thinkers. It's meant to be a moment to sit back, listen, reflect, think, and ask questions. Please do write those questions into the Q&A box, not the chat box. And you can start those questions coming in right from the start. So please don't hold back. I will moderate those questions. I very much hope to be able to read all of them. We often do get quite a few questions, so that isn't always possible, but I will always try and read out to Priya what I can. We want you to listen, reflect, and ask questions. Most of all, if you do tweet though, that's absolutely fine. Our hashtag is Food Thinkers and our handle is at Food Policy City. And of course, we'll be back with more Food Thinkers webinars in 2022. So let's go over to Priya now, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Family and Consumer Studies at the University of Utah, and received a PhD in sociology from Stanford University and her postdoc at the National Institutes of Health scholar at the Stanford University School of Medicine. And her work focuses on identifying mechanisms underlying the reproduction of health qualities in the United States. And she brings a sociological lens to examining the structural and social determinants of nutritional inequalities and disparities in diet, something that we work a lot on at the Centre for Food Policy. So I'm really excited to welcome Priya this evening. And I first came across Priya's work reading one of her just fabulous papers, which shone such insights into understanding why people eat what they do. Her research is writing, and I've seen her writing also in the Harvard Business Review on women's leadership issues as well, and in other newspapers, American newspapers, such as the Washington Post. But what's really exciting is that she's got a new book, which is just out, which is what she's going to be talking about today, How the Other Half Eats, the Untold Story of Food Inequality in America. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to you, Priya, and really excited to listen to your presentation. Over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that really kind introduction, Professor Hawkes. And thank you so much to you and the Center for Food Policy for inviting me here to speak today. I'm really excited about the opportunity to share my work with all of you and to engage in a discussion about my findings and future directions. So today I'm going to be talking about a stream of research that features in my book, How the Other Half Eats. And in this research, I draw on years of fieldwork that I conducted in the San Francisco Bay Area on families' diets to show how the emotions that mothers across the income spectrum feel about feeding their kids really fundamentally shape what goes onto their children's plates. Now, before I start, you may be asking yourself, what do moms' emotions have to do with kids' diets? And that's a reasonable question because scholarship on families' diets and dietary inequalities very rarely, if ever, discuss the emotions or how parents feel about the food that their kids eat. But through my research on the ground with families, I learned that emotions are actually really central to how mothers remain in the US, at least the parent still primarily responsible for feeding. These emotions are really central to how mothers feed their kids. And my goal today is to help explain why. So I'm going to start by telling you briefly about two moms that I interviewed as a part of my work. So the first mom was a low-income mother named Brenda. And Brenda had immigrated 17 years earlier to the San Francisco Bay Area from Colombia. And since then, she had worked as a cashier, a home aide, and a hardware floor sales rep. And since arriving on American soil, Brenda had also experienced family deportation, unemployment, repeated evictions, as well as food insecurity. Indeed, a consistent theme of Brenda's experience feeding her children was that at times there was simply not enough money to ensure that she, her husband, and her kids had enough of the food that they wanted to eat. And this was a hard fact for Brenda to come to terms with, and the guilt of struggling to provide weighed on her. Yet, experienced as Brenda was with this reality, she was also adept at making food go further for her family. And she was equally, if not more, skilled at reframing the hardship of hunger as opportunity. Brenda told me that one thing she'd learned over the years was that food tasted better when you divided it up, when you rationed it between people. Remembering this helped her see a glass half full when the cupboards emptied out. And she instilled this positive lesson in her children too. She told me, since they were kids, I teach them to share one item for everybody. Then they appreciate how good is that item. Not one person, two-person is better. It really tastes better. 5 weeks later, I sat down with Amber Dawson, a high-income white mom who, since earning her MBA at Stanford, had been a full-time caregiver to her two daughters while her husband worked as a venture capitalist. While Amber was unfamiliar with experiences of food insecurity and struggling to provide enough food, that didn't mean that she didn't also feel guilty. The day Amber and I met, she told me that she felt like a failure. Her daughter, Leanne, had recently become addicted to Starbucks. And what was worse, Amber had found that she was giving in to her daughter's Frappuccino requests just to keep the peace. Pausing to reflect for a moment, Amber explained, "We're probably on the not great end of the spectrum. I know kids who eat a lot better than my kids do." Amber felt like such a terrible mother when it came to feeding her daughters, to the point where at the end of our conversation, she requested that I please change her name before I published anything from our interview. A few months into my field research, I began to grapple with a contradiction. I walked away from interviews with lower income moms like Brenda, knowing that they were parenting under exceptionally challenging conditions that made feeding kids difficult. At the same time, these moms didn't always seem or act so worried about how their kids were eating. Even though they discussed wanting their kids to eat nutritiously and they voiced frustration about how that didn't always happen, these moms also seemed somewhat surprisingly okay with the situation. In contrast, I emerged from interviews with more affluent mothers like Amber feeling the exact opposite. These moms were so stressed and troubled by their children's diets that even though I knew that these families had ample resources for food, I felt like in some ways they were struggling even more than lower income moms. But over time, my analysis of these conversations and interactions with mothers showed me that these very different narratives and feelings that moms displayed about feeding kids actually illustrated moms' very different approaches to navigating the maternal guilt that arose due to that feeding. In feeding children, Brenda, Amber, and other mothers I met were beholden to particular cultural standards for motherhood, standards that in the United States have escalated over the past 30 years and that are referred to by sociologists as the ideology of intensive mothering. The intensive mothering ideology specifies that mothers must be their children's primary caregivers and utilize child-centered, expert-guided, emotionally absorbing, labor-intensive, and financially expensive child-rearing methods. In the US, the intensive mothering ideology is widely diffused across society, with the cultural consensus being that it is the ideal mothering approach. However, because of the incredible difficulty of any mother of living up to these cultural ideas of what a good mother is that are set by intensive mothering, most mothers in the US report feeling a strong sense of guilt. Maternal guilt involves mothers' sense that they can never do enough for their children. And in the US, scholars argued that the cultural ascendance of unrealistic mothering expectations combined with a complete lack of structural supports for caregiving is what leaves mothers feeling as though they are constantly falling short, which leads to the consistent research finding that today, guilt is a cornerstone of contemporary motherhood. But for me, as someone who studies food and diet and inequality, I was interested in this question: how do mothers' feelings or experiences of guilt shape how they feed their children? And if that seems like a kind of silly question, the reason that I ask it is because of just how core, how germane really feeding kids is to the project of intensive mothering and to these overarching cultural ideas about what it means to be a good mom. The work that mothers do to feed children, or what sociologists fancily call maternal food work, is a highly gendered, laborious, and increasingly high-stakes parenting task. It's also a task that, in the US, in 4 out of 5 married heterosexual couples with children, mothers are primarily in charge of. And it's also a task for which there are virtually no institutional or structural supports to manage really any of its demands. So to investigate this question and to try to understand how mothers' feelings of guilt related to families' diets and kids' diets, I leveraged data from a broader qualitative study of families, for which I conducted 160 interviews with parents and kids over the course of 2 years in the San Francisco Bay Area about how families ate. Today, I'm going to focus on data that comes from the interviews I conducted with 74 mothers across the income spectrum. In these interviews, I spoke with mothers about how they fed their children, as well as their expectations of, their challenges with, and their conflicts around feeding. And my goal through these interviews was not just to understand what and how mothers fed their kids, but also to understand how mothers thought and felt and made sense of their children's and their families' diets. In addition to these interviews, I also conducted participant observations of 4 moms and their families as they went about their days, talking about planning for preparing and eating food. During these observations, I was embedded in families' everyday experiences, so I had the opportunity to observe all kinds of activities. I attended birthday parties with families. I went to Sunday morning church services. I chopped fruit at their kitchen counters, sat in drive-through lanes with them, stood outside food banks with them. And through all of this data collection, what I was able to observe was what food meant to mothers, how mothers thought and felt and made sense of the way that their kids ate. Through all this data collection, what I also learned was that moms across the income spectrum shared, in the broadest strokes, some pretty similar ideas about how they, as mothers, should be feeding their children. So there was really important variation across class and race in mothers' exact expectations of themselves. But across my entire sample, two major straightforward expectations about maternal food work and kids' diets stood out. So first, most mothers believed that their children should be eating a healthy diet, and they shared broadly similar ideas about what that meant that aligned with what scholars have referred to as a mainstream healthy eating discourse. So things like vegetables and fruits and whole grains and lean meats were, in general, foods that mothers considered to be healthy choices for their children, while unhealthy foods generally included things like soda, candy, chips, fast food. Second, most mothers agreed that good moms were aware of and invested in what kids ate. Almost every mother that I met who was, the primary caregiver in her family believed that she was the one who was responsible for ensuring that her children ate a healthy diet. And yet, most mothers that I met also felt like they were failing to live up to these standards. The resulting gap between mothers' expectations and their perceptions of their actual performance generated feelings of guilt. Indeed, 63 out of 74 mothers expressed feeling guilty during our interviews. While most moms cared about their kids' diets, they also felt that their kids didn't always eat the healthiest diet, and that these dietary flaws that they saw were because moms didn't do the best job. For instance, Catalina, a Latina mother, told me that her full-time job sometimes demanded that she stay late at the office in the evenings. And so she went through periods where she would order her children dinner from a nearby taqueria. She told me, I'm like, this is horrible. I'm pumping my family and myself full of junk. Similarly, Penelope, a white mother, explained that she cooked dinner for her family Monday through Thursday, but she ran out of energy by Friday when she ended up buying frozen Indian meals for everyone. She told me, it feels awful to do it, but I just can't keep up. While mothers across my sample expressed feelings of guilt, like Penelope and Catalina, I also found that mothers' strategies for navigating that guilt varied dramatically across the income spectrum. Specifically, what varied was how mothers engaged in what is known as emotion work to navigate that guilt. When faced with an emotional dilemma or problem, one key way that a person can seek to assuage or eliminate that dilemma is by doing what the sociologist Arlie Hochschild calls working on feeling, or engaging in emotion work. Emotion work is the internal work that each of us do to monitor, assess, inhibit, evoke, and shape our emotions in particular ways. Importantly, emotion work isn't just about trying to display the right emotions on the outside. It means actively trying to manage internally the ones that come up. So for instance, by trying to transform one's feelings of disappointment into gratitude, or change one's frustration into a feeling of contentment. And within families, we know that emotion work is generally very gendered, with women and mothers as the ones who are continually working on their feelings in order to accommodate others and to keep families functioning harmoniously. The mothers that I interviewed engaged in emotion work to manage the guilt that they experienced around food work. But the particular emotion work strategies they employed differed dramatically across income levels. So lower income mothers like Brenda dealt with enormous challenges and resource constraints that made feeding kids difficult. These mothers also knew that real meaningful improvements to their financial circumstances were unlikely. And that meant that it was just as unlikely that their kids' diets would ever meaningfully improve. That's not to say that low-income moms didn't try to get their kids to eat more nutritiously, but many did so wholly cognizant of the limitations. As a rational response to such intractable constraints, these mothers employed the emotion work strategy of downscaling. With the deck so clearly stacked against them, low-income moms pushed down the feelings of guilt in an effort to come to terms with their current realities. That is, they did the internal emotion work to feel better about how things were, to accept their own food work and their children's diets. In downscaling, low-income moms found a survival strategy that helped them solve the emotional dilemma of guilt and also preserve a sense of dignity. In contrast, many high-income moms often took the opposite approach. These mothers engaged in upscaling, whereby they ratcheted up the already very high and unattainable societal standards by which they were evaluated as mothers, and in doing so, found their feelings of guilt escalating too. Upscaling compelled mothers to do more and more on their children's behalf, with mothers' hope that doing so would eventually alleviate the guilt, although it rarely, if ever, did. Just as downscaling was a pragmatic, emotional response to low-income mothers' resource constraints, upscaling was enabled by the fact that high-income mothers could generally leverage their greater resources to continually do more. To do the emotion work of upscaling and downscaling, mothers employed a concrete set of approaches. Low-income moms zoomed out of the present moment to reflect on harder, earlier times. They deprioritized diet and nutrition and prioritized other aspects of children's well-being. And they benchmarked their food work off of other worse-off families to assuage feelings of guilt. High-income mothers, on the other hand, continually raised an already unattainable bar so that it could never fully be met. They hyper-prioritized and drilled down on their kids' diets. And like low-income families, they also compared themselves to other families, but often only to feel more guilty about their food work. I'm going to briefly walk through each of these strategies to show how they work in practice, focusing on just one or two mothers for each strategy in the interest of time. I'm also going to move back and forth between the high and the low income strategies to draw out the comparisons. And you can use this legend that I've put at the bottom of the slide to help keep track of where we are. So one way that low-income moms downscaled was by taking a wider lens than the current moment. They thought back to prior times when things were much harder to shine a positive light on a current situation, difficult as it may have been. When I first met Lorena Garcia, a mom of two, Lorena told me that she felt badly about how her family had been eating lately. A month prior, Lorena had lost her job, and now she was hemorrhaging money and time as she searched furiously for a new position and performed side hustles to make ends meet. The result was that her kids weren't really eating any of the home-cooked meals that Lorena would have wanted them to. But when I asked Lorena explicitly if she faced any challenges when it came to feeding her family, her answer caught me off guard. Lorena insisted that I don't really have any challenges at this time. What was Lorena talking about? Minutes earlier, she had detailed a number of serious issues, job insecurity and time scarcity among them. Lorena's response confused me until weeks later, when upon replaying the audio of our conversation for the umpteenth time, I realized that Lorena had interpreted the question differently than I'd intended. She'd answered the question by thinking about challenges in relative terms, comparing her current situation to previous periods in her life. When Lorena stacked this current moment up against earlier, more difficult ones, she found that she had very little to feel badly about. Lorena explained, there was a time in our lives where, before even I met my husband, that my children and I had it really bad. I had barely enough to pay the bills and not much to pay for food. Compared to back then, food today wasn't too hard for Lorena. She could downscale to shine a positive light on any challenges she encountered. Sure, Lorena was spending over half of her side gig income on food, but at least she had some income. And sure, she rarely had time to cook, but at least now she lived near a Jack in a Box and a KFC. By thinking back to times when things were really tough, Lorena could downscale her guilt into feeling better about any current shortcomings. In contrast, high-income moms often upscaled to feel worse about current shortcomings. And one way that they did this was by continually increasing the already high societal expectations of themselves so that they inevitably fell short. Janae, a Black high-income mom of 3 and corporate lawyer, exemplified this upscaling approach of raising the bar. Janae's bar for herself was a moving target. The closer she got to it, the higher it could be raised. Janae wanted her 3 teenage daughters to eat healthy dinners, but she felt that her demanding work schedule drove her to often order takeout during weeknights. Janae told me, embarrassed, there was a point in time where we did takeout like 3 days a week. People, they all know me. Like I would just call and they would say, hi, Janae, your usual? Yeah, okay, bye-bye. And they would meet me on the road. It's embarrassing. Things came to a head for Janae when her kids told their grandmother, Janae's mother, about this routine. One time my mom asked my children, what does mommy cook for you each night? And they said, whatever's in the bag, meaning the takeout bag. And I was crushed. As a mom, talk about guilt. The guilt led Janae to ask herself an important question. She asked herself, can I not figure this out to be a mom, a working mom? Janae figured out a solution, and that solution was getting a new, less demanding job. When I met Janae, she had been in her new role for 4 months. While the hours were still long, they were more manageable, and Janae now had time to prepare weeknight dinners. But Janae's honeymoon period after the job change was short-lived. She quickly found new ways to raise the bar for herself, and in doing so, still feel guilty. Janae was now making dinners regularly during the week, but she started to feel badly that her dinners were more semi-homemade than homemade. The pre-cut vegetables and whole roasted chicken she purchased became a new source of guilt. Janae's original goal had been to make more dinners at home, but that goal soon vanished, replaced by a new one. Now homemade had to mean from scratch. It had to mean using raw, whole ingredients, lots of prep work, and ideally at least an hour of cooking time and a recipe. Unless dinner was a hot meal that Janae had planned out and over which she had labored for hours, she felt that what she was offering her daughters just wasn't good enough. Janae told me Trader Joe's, which is a supermarket in the US, even has the whole thing that you toss with the sauce. I'm like, you're kidding. It's almost embarrassing because I think literally one time dinner was done in 5 minutes. Like the chicken lasagna, here's a salad. Everyone's happy. Everyone's happy. And it's like we're cheating. Even though Janae had worked hard to get to the point where she was making her kids dinner every night, even changing her professional path to do so, when she finally got there, she could only feel guilty that she wasn't doing more. What keeps you up at night is a question that I asked Lorena as we sat in her living room, a bowl of chips between us. 3 months earlier, Lorena's son, Alejandro, had been recruited into a gang, and now Lorena didn't know where he went most evenings. She told me, I worry that I'm going to wake up to the police knocking on my door, telling me my son's been shot. In the face of the very real possibility of losing her son, Lorena rearranged her priorities, and diet and nutrition were far from at the top of that list. Lorena's most pressing concern wasn't whether she was getting Alejandro to eat enough broccoli. More pressing were her children's safety and emotional well-being, and these priorities took clear precedence over healthy meals. In situations like these, low-income moms like Lorena downscaled the guilt they may have felt about their kids' diets by shifting the focus away from diet and nutrition, focusing instead on other aspects of child rearing, where moms felt like they were doing a better job, like keeping their kids safe, secure, or even just satiated. Jimena Morales, a soft-spoken mom of 3, exemplified this. Living undocumented, Jimena told me, made everything more complicated. A few months before I met her, Jimena's sons had been beaten up by a local gang, forcing Jimena to look for a new home in a different neighborhood. But with a private housing market offering few affordable options, Jimena had been forced to temporarily split the family up. At the time that she and I met, Jimena and her youngest son, Juan, were living in her car. Jimena told me, it's ugly undergoing this situation, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. We eat in the street. We live in the street. Living in the street meant not having a kitchen to cook in or a fridge to store food in. Eating in the street meant that she and Juan ate out almost every evening at mostly Pizza Hut and Kentucky Fried Chicken. Eating out not only staved off hunger, but it also offered a toilet to use and a sink to wash up in. It offered a place to sit down that wasn't Jimena's driver's seat. It offered a fleeting feeling of normalcy. Now, it wasn't that Jimena particularly loved fast food or thought it was a healthy choice for her son. To the contrary, she was deeply worried about Juan's diet. She told me, in the name of Jesus, this needs to end. I need to find a place for us to live so I can make them food, because meals are very important. The most important thing is having fresh food, eating healthy. But as Jimena stared down the constellation of impossibly difficult circumstances facing her and her family, she knew that her kids' safety was simply more important than their fruit and vegetable consumption. So Jimena downscaled the guilt about what her kids were eating to highlight the ways that she was still able to do right by them. Jimena worried less about the nutritional content of their diets and more about how she could do right by them in other ways. One way, she told me, was by making sure that each of her sons got to choose where they ate. She told me, they say, I want McDonald's, I want Taco Bell, I want Pollo Loco, I want Carl's Jr., I want Chinese food. I give everyone the same privilege so that they're happy. For me, all of them are equal because all of them are my children and I adore all of them very much and I want the best for them. Jimena did not feel great about the fast food, but she worked hard on her emotions to create a feeling of comfort, calm even, in the midst of a heart-wrenching situation. She downscaled the guilt she felt come up inside so as not to be reduced by the current tumult. Unlike Jimena, affluent moms do not generally have to worry to the same extent, if at all, about their children's safety, shelter, or satiety. Taking these basic needs for granted freed up mom's mental energy and space to focus on other aspects of their children's well-being, like their diet. Rather than deprioritizing diet, higher income moms instead focused on how to optimize kids' diets. They identified problems with their own approach and their children's intake, and they devised solutions to fix them. Virginia Bowen, a white stay-at-home mother, illustrated this upscaling approach. At the interview's outset, Virginia brought up the fact to me that her oldest son, Wells, was overweight. She told me, from a psychology point of view, I super worry about his weight. I feel like I sort of lost that battle. I can only hope when he goes off to college, he makes good decisions. It's up to him and he has to, and I hope he will. It's one of my greatest angsts in life. Wells' weight made Virginia feel guilty, like she wasn't personally doing a good enough job at modeling and teaching healthy dietary habits to her children. She told me, I do not understand how I can do that and that's how our children eat, and I have a kid who overeats, so I only pray that modeling will help. In an attempt to assuage her guilt at falling short, Virginia upscaled by doubling down on her food work. With 3 meals a day and plenty more opportunities to snack, Virginia and other high-income moms found that they could embrace all of these moments to try to fix their kids' diets. Without worries about kids' safety or security, these mothers could elevate food work as a central parenting priority. Virginia, for one, was continuously vacillating between a more hands-on and a more hands-off approach to fixing Wells's diet. Earlier, Virginia explained to me she had tried talking to Wells about the importance of healthy eating. But when that had yielded little benefit, Virginia decided that she would have to proactively regulate which food she made available to him. She told me about healthy food. Now I pretty much put it in front of them. Snack-wise, that's what I do. I put the grapes out on the counter half an hour ago because I know he will come home and see them and grab them. But even this approach didn't yield the intended effect, as Wells started hoarding junk food in his nightstand. But with each failed attempt, Virginia continued to upscale, indulging her guilt as she sought out new and greater opportunities to do a better job feeding her son. When I asked low-income moms about their families' diets, moms often told me that compared to other families, They were doing okay. Benchmarking against financially worse off families, I learned, was a key downscaling strategy that helped transform mothers' feelings of guilt about shortcomings into ones of pride. Kiara, a Black mom of 5 and a school cafeteria employee, illustrated this approach. Even though I met Kiara in line at a food bank, and even though she complained about the rising cost of food, and even though she told me that her SNAP benefits ran out the 3rd week of every single month, Kiara felt that her kids' diets were much better than the diets of the children whose trays she filled each school day. I interviewed Kiara on Veterans Day, and Kiara told me, some babies is not going to eat today because school's not in. Like if it's vacation, what they going to eat when they's on vacation? That's not fair for babies to come to school hungry. Compared to the parents and families of those children, Kiara shared that she didn't have no challenges. No, I have a lot of support. Even if I did, I have a lot of support, so I wouldn't even have those challenges. Some people don't have that, so thank God for that. I won't have any of those challenges. Kiara knew other single moms with no safety net. She knew moms who were at the food pantry every week rather than every month. She knew moms who would have qualified for all of the government assistance that she received, but they were undocumented, so they had no housing vouchers and no food stamps. As Kiara called these moms to the front of her mind, she downscaled her guilt to assure herself that she was doing just fine. Kiara told me people that's living on the streets that's homeless, they have challenges. And some people can't provide for their children, but I don't have those. While observing other families helped lower income moms downscale their guilt, doing the exact same thing could have the opposite effect on their more affluent counterparts. When higher income moms looked at their neighbors, colleagues, and fellow PTA members, they found proof that they could be doing better. This was most apparent among full-time employed mothers who discussed how their employment was both a barrier to healthy eating as well as an ongoing source of guilt. Lori Galvez, a Latina mother who worked 50-hour weeks at a nonprofit, told me, I've always been a working mom, and I feel like the children don't get their 3 square meals like a lot of moms that don't work. Their children get a breakfast in the morning and their mom makes them lunch, and then they come home to a dinner at like 5:30. While Lori recognized that her children may have eaten differently than their peers because both she and her spouse worked full-time, this acknowledgement did not assuage her feelings of guilt or stop her from comparing her own shopping and feeding approaches to mothers with more time to devote to those tasks. With mothers who served as their children's full-time caregivers, Lori felt that there was a little more creativity going on. You know, we have the parent groups and they bring snacks, and it's always interesting what they bring. A lot of them shop at different stores. They shop at Trader Joe's. I barely go to Trader Joe's. Yet it wasn't just full-time employed high-income moms who use social comparison to upscale their guilt. Even stay-at-home mothers, though the ones who did have the time and the energy to devote to food, even these mothers compared themselves to others to deepen their sense of guilt about what they could be doing better. Emma was one such parent. Emma dedicated a great deal of time to food work, preparing most meals for her children from scratch during the week. Emma told me, I do a lot of cooking and I try to make sure it's filling emotionally and physically. It's important to me. Yet even Emma felt that she was not doing as well as she could be, and she discussed repeatedly how she felt guilty about the fact that she couldn't get her sons to eat more vegetables. She told me, I really need to push more vegetables. I don't think I'm as good at it as I should be. Emma knew she wasn't as good at it as she should be by benchmarking her performance against others, specifically mothers who she believed showed greater discipline. She described one of her friends, also a stay-at-home mother, who embodied the maternal food work traits that Emma thought that she fell short of. Emma told me about this friend. She bakes, but she bakes healthy muffins and that kind of stuff, but healthier than my chocolate chip cookies. And they cook every night, every week, and really only go out for birthdays. Emma's food work would have been the envy of so many mothers that I met, particularly full-time employed mothers. But when Emma stacked herself up against others, she upscaled her guilt and was left feeling that she was falling far short of where she should be. So I want to wrap up by sharing what I think examining and taking seriously emotions like guilt, emotion work strategies like upscaling and downscaling, and mothers' lived experiences can teach us about nutritional inequality. So these are topics that are, at least to my eye, glaringly absent from our broader conversations about nutritional and dietary disparities. And I think the assumption is that emotions are tangential to or irrelevant to how each of us eats and feeds. Even in conversations in the US context about how broader structural forces or inequalities drive our diets apart, we tend to forget that these inequalities don't just impact what we earn or where we live. These inequalities simultaneously exert incredible influence on us by shaping the very things that we think and that we feel. As the sociologist Arlie Hochschild once said, power doesn't work its way around feeling, it works its way through feeling. And so as I've given you a taste today, and as I dive into more deeply in my book, I see feelings as actually quite central to the story of feeding. And that means that feelings are also a part of the story of inequality too. Almost every mom that I met felt guilty about her food work. And most moms I met also engaged in emotion work to navigate these feelings of guilt, of worry, and just a general sense of inadequacy that arose as they tried to feed their kids and live up to cultural ideas about what it means to be a good mother in the US. But the strategies that moms used and the consequences of those strategies diverged sharply based on their broader context and constraints. For lower income moms, downscaling could serve as an extremely effective strategy to navigate ongoing hardship and adversity that consistently challenged mothers' abilities to feed their kids the way that they wanted. At the same time, it's possible that downscaling can also work to inadvertently help cement less privileged families' diets in place through lowering mothers' expectations and beliefs in what's possible for their children food-wise. On the other hand, more affluent mothers' upscaling help drive their continual pursuit of a better diet for their children. But by the same token, to the degree that upscaling compels more and more work for mothers, it can also aid in pulling these families' diets further and further away from families with fewer resources. My hope is that moving forward, we can start to examine and integrate an understanding of how our emotions, emotion work strategies, and lived experiences, eating and feeding, that we can start to integrate that into the stories that we tell about food and inequality. And with that, I will end. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and I really look forward to your questions.
Wow, thank you very much, Priya. I have to say I was gripped. I haven't been gripped by a talk for quite a long time, I have to say, as I was by your talk. Really incredible penetrating insights, which of course are taken from the American context, but I think have much broader application in general about the way that we think about, as you said, about food and eating, and how we need to look at all of these different elements of it in order to really understand it. So thank you very much for sharing your fascinating research. I'm extremely excited to read your book. So please do put questions into the Q&A and I'll get going with asking them. I'm going to add on a little one of my own to the end of the first question here, which is from Gozel. And she uses the term heartbreaking. And I have to say that when I was listening and when I was hearing both from the low income and from the higher income, I think heartbreaking was something that I was feeling as well. And Gozel says it's heartbreaking to hear these testimonies, as it sounds like women move in a perpetual state of guilt, shame, and self-sabotage, even if they shouldn't. Is there a way that women can reduce self-sabotage and increase their confidence so they don't do that? My question added on to the end of that is that how are gender relationships in the home and with partnerships in the home and co-parenting and so on, how does that play into this and the relationships between partners in parenting? So one is a way that women can reduce self-sabotage and increase confidence, and for me a question about the relationships in the home with partners.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, those are great questions. So my first inclination whenever we talk about what needs to change is to not tell parents or mothers that they need to do anything differently. At the same time, part of the reason that I wanted to write this book and to bring these stories forward was to generate an awareness around just how emotional, how discouraging, how difficult it is to feed children in this contemporary context, and just how much responsibility and accountability is placed on mothers' plates without, at least in the US context, any support for that work. And to be honest, any real acknowledgement or valuing of that as work rather than just what women are expected to do. So, I have had the opportunity to share my work with a number of mothers and with mothers who participated in the research. And the thing that that means the most to me is when they say that it gave them an appreciation of the work that they do, and it made them feel a little bit more sympathetic to their own struggles, and it gave them the opportunity to give themselves more grace and slack. I think also just having that awareness of the fact that the deck is really stacked against mothers as far as being able to feed their kids the way that they want. And that's obviously especially true for low-income mothers who face incredible resource constraints. But even, higher income mothers, like we live in a country that where the food and beverage industry has an incredible amount of power and saturates our environments with less healthy food and markets to children, and makes it really difficult for moms to feed their kids the way that they want. So I guess the short answer to your question is, I don't think there's an easy fix, but my hope is that bringing these conversations to light and bringing this to light will help just each person who is a mother or a parent or a caregiver reflect on all that they're doing well and all the ways that they're succeeding and doing right by their kids, rather than harping on the ways that they may feel that they're falling short. Corinna, to your question about the relationships with family, with other members of the household. So I have a chapter in the book where I talk about the role of fathers in heterosexual couples with children. And I interviewed some fathers who were primary caregivers to children and were the parent more responsible for food in the household. But in the US, as I mentioned, in 80% of families, that's not the case. And I found that for mothers, while having a partner was helpful in the sense that it generated more income to spend on food, fathers often didn't see themselves as responsible for ensuring that kids ate a healthy diet. And fathers' lack of feeling of accountability or responsibility often really stressed mothers out, in the sense that fathers agreed, like, our kids should eat a healthy diet, but they felt like it wasn't necessarily their job to do that. And mothers were acutely aware of that if mothers weren't the ones who were looking out for their kids' diets, who were making sure to remind their kids to eat broccoli or trying to stop them from getting fast food, mothers didn't always feel confident that fathers would step in and do those things in their absence. And so that kind of raised that feeling of already really high responsibility and kind of like the societal expectation. It raised the stakes even higher for mothers. And so in the book, I talk about, how we can think about redistributing this work within families too, so that it's something that is shared and valued across caregivers.
I think that's a really important point. And it is extraordinary when you think how important food is to health and well-being in so many different ways, that there isn't more support, and that these gender inequalities and so on are just accepted as normal. It's extraordinary. I just want to jump to a question from Halal. because it relates to what you've just been asking, which is how do you address this emotional inequality with policy, with public policy, with nutrition policies, as she said? Is there a role? I mean, from where we're sitting at the Centre for Food Policy, that's what we're thinking all the time about, how policy can play a role, public policy. Mm-hmm. Do you have a sense of how policymakers can help provide the support, or whatever other kind of solutions are required?
I do. I mean, I think, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, this maternal guilt in general is really driven by this disconnect between these cultural ideas about what a good mother is, and then the complete lack in the US of structural supports for caregiving. When I think about policies that would help alleviate some of that guilt, I think about policies that would basically shift some of the work that mothers are doing onto institutions. And in doing so, mothers might not feel like they're completely responsible for their children's diets. And so, in the US, kind of amazingly during the pandemic, school meals became, at least temporarily, universal, in the sense that all kids had access to 2 meals a day in schools, regardless of family's income. And I've written about how powerful of a policy this is, not just for children's diets and for, like we know in the US, that access to school meals is really important for kids' educational outcomes and academic achievement, but it's also a huge deal for mothers, because mothers in the US, other than mothers who are really, really financially constrained, like the poverty level, the poverty line is so low in the US that you have to be very, very poor to qualify for school breakfast and lunch for your children. But anyone who's above that, those mothers have to take care of those meals every single day. And that is a ton of cognitive, physical, and financial labor. And so if schools can take some of that on, one, that not only kind of frees up some of mothers' time, of course, but I think it also sends this message that is like, we as a society, we think it's our responsibility too, to nourish children and to feed kids and to teach them about food. And it's not just this private child rearing task where mothers have to take all of that on. And so I think things like, I have a lot of work that's written about like starting with kids and trying to implement policies that help shape kids' diets and ideas about food. But I think that those policies are so powerful because I think they can also shape the emotional experiences of mom by taking some of that work off their plate and sending a signal to mom that the country and the government are also invested in what kids are eating.
And that's a fantastic answer. It's actually a conclusion that we've drawn from the work that we do here as well. So it's fantastic to hear that. And just to quickly add on to that, a question from Charlotte about the policy response to the gender inequalities that you mentioned. Is that also about an institutional response, or is there something particular about addressing that balance? You mentioned about supporting kind of more evenness in the households around that.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, let me just. Who asked this question? I want to make sure I can read it.
Charlotte, she says, you spoke about there being little support for mechanisms to support women's food work. What do you see as the effective nutrition policies or interventions which specifically acknowledge the gendered natures of food work?
Yeah, such a good question. I feel like this is such a difficult one to answer, because I think about policies that make it possible for fathers, for instance, to be more present at home and to take on more of that work. At the same time, these gendered expectations and roles are so stubborn to change in the US context, at least. Like we saw during the pandemic, even when, research showing that even when both parents were working from home, fathers did a little bit more, but after a few months, that actually went back to kind of the same division of labor. And so fathers' presence in the home is, I think, kind of like this necessary condition, but I don't think it's sufficient enough to actually change the division of labor. I think of this as kind of a something that needs to happen both through policies that encourage flexible workplaces and paternity leave and all of that stuff, but also in kind of changes in the public discourse about the expectations of mothers and what is mothers' biological role, and kind of like what we expect mothers to do and what we expect them to take on. I also do think that work that mothers tend to do, or that women tend to do, tends to be very devalued. And so if we can elevate food work as something really valuable and important in society, that actually might help address some of the gender inequality. So I don't have an easy answer to that question, but I think it's really complex, and there's both the policy element of it, but then there's also these really deeply held cultural ideas about like just natural gendered abilities to nourish children that I think are really stubborn to kick.
It's fascinating. And we also work in lower income countries, and we've been doing a review recently. A colleague was doing a review about gender around some of these public policies, and looking at social safety nets, social protection, welfare benefits, whatever you call them. And the way that it's done is you give them to women, because women are much more likely to spend money on a way that supports the nutrition of their children as opposed to their male partners. But at the same time, and that's considered good to empower women, but actually it also just places all the responsibility on women. So it has a good impact for women on one hand. On the other hand, it just reinforces gender norms. And I find that changing those gender norms in low income countries as well as higher income ones is just extraordinarily difficult. But let's switch gears to a question to Ivan here. I'd be interested to understand whether mums viewed their children's diet as separate to their own diet. I sense there's a trend towards parents eating a different meal to their children, and was interested if this came out in your research at all.
Yeah, this is such a great question. So I think in the US, at least, this idea that kids should eat different food than their parents is a pretty recent phenomenon, in the sense that over the past 30 years, the food industry has really marketed this idea that there are foods that are right for kids and there are foods that are right for adults, and the two shouldn't necessarily mix. And you can see that in, when you step into a supermarket, and there's a lot of marketing directly towards children, but also marketing that reassures parents that those are good choices for kids. And I think that on the one hand, mothers that I met often tried to feed their kids what they were eating too. But I think that, for especially lower income moms who were so worried about food waste and wasting money by having to throw out food, they often tried to cater to what their kids wanted. And often a lot of the time that was food that was marketed to children and that they knew that their kids would eat. And again, kind of trace this to a food industry that has made incredible profits off of designing products that are really appealing to children, that they definitely want to consume, and that, the food industry markets it as like, this is a good fix for moms, but it actually just makes moms feel really guilty, because what they would prefer is if their kids ate the food that they ate too. But they're so worried at the same time about having to throw out food that their kids won't eat, that I found a lot of mothers did end up feeding their kids different stuff that they just felt like 100% sure that their children would consume. And just kind of relatedly, for low income moms, as I mentioned, like things like satiety were really, really important for their children. Like it was really important to them that their kids didn't go to bed hungry. And one way to assure that was to make sure to give their kids what they asked for. And that was not necessarily what moms wanted to eat themselves or what they were eating.
Yeah, again, fascinating. Thank you. Beth has got a question here, which is around the ethical consumption pressures. And she says it amongst low-income mothers, but I think it must also be the case for higher income too, perhaps, about the idea that one should buy food ethically, sustainable sources or whatever kind of mark. Does that play into this narrative at all, or is that so far away from what people are thinking about?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So I found more so than with low income mothers, ethical consumption was really something that came up almost exclusively among the higher income mothers that I met. For the lower income mothers, I think ethical consumption was a bit of a luxury that they couldn't afford when mothers are trying really just to buy enough food for their kids and make sure that their kids don't go hungry, and also that their kids get to eat some of what they want. The kind of sourcing of that food was of less concern. For higher income moms for whom, the cost of food was really not an issue, they were more, I wouldn't say all moms, but I would say there were a number of high income moms who I met who talked about these ethical consumption pressures. And the way that I think it plays into this story is that it just creates yet another really high bar that moms have to meet in order to feel like they're doing a good job. So it's not just enough to feed your kids fruits or vegetables. Those fruits and vegetables also have to be locally sourced or organic. And what I find so striking about this is, on the one hand, I really admire the moms who valued ethical consumption and who worked really hard to ensure that what they were buying met those standards. On the other hand, again, it's all on them to make sure that those foods meet those standards, rather than just having these policies that ensure that our food is ethically produced, and that all of the food that we offer in this country is safe to eat, and that it was created with fair wages. And so it's, again, this kind of shift of this responsibility onto the consumer. And it just created for mothers other ways that they could feel like they were falling short. Like some moms talked about how they bought vegetables, but they weren't always organic. Like, it kind of creates all these other little ways that you can say, okay, I'm doing my best, but it's still not good enough. And so I think that's how that really plays into the emotional landscape of feeding.
Great, thank you. Killian's got a question about social media. What are some of the feelings surrounding the pressure moms felt about how they feed their kids in relation to social media? Did any of those feelings draw mothers away from their ability to understand what is or what isn't nutritious?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, social media came up a bit. I feel like the generation that I interviewed was maybe slightly less into social media than like parents of young children right now. These are mothers who were in their 50s a few years ago. I think social media has really taken off in the last, it's taken off in the last like decade, but really in the last like 5-6 years. And so I feel like we're in social media, and the internet kind of came into play in our conversations, was, again, just all of this information that is hurtled at and available to mothers about how to eat that often makes mothers second guess what they're doing. If I log onto my Instagram account and I scroll through, there are so many messages that I get about how I'm supposed to parent and what is the best way to feed my toddler and what is the wrong way to do it. And I think that creates, again, this context within which it can feel almost like there are always wrong answers, like there are only wrong answers. And so I think that what is so unique about the world that we live in right now is just how much access we have to how other people are doing things, and to expert advice, and to the advice of people who also aren't experts. And I think all of that can help drive a sense of confusion about, on the one hand, that's amazing. Like we have access to these resources, but it can also kind of complicate the story about what you want to do. You can always find kind of evidence that you should be doing it another way. And I remember I talked to one stay-at-home father who was in charge of feeding his kids, Joaquin, and he was so frustrated because he really just wanted to feed his kids the best way possible. And he had a garden in his backyard, and he made, crusts for quiche from scratch. And he told me he just wished someone could tell him what the right way to eat was. And he said, I've been trying for 5 years to just figure out the answer, and I cannot figure it out. And it drives me crazy. And I thought that was such a powerful statement, because this is someone with the most privilege, the most luxury. Obviously in this case, he was doing some upscaling, but even he felt just confused, like he couldn't get to the right answer. And I think that, that is really a product of kind of the virtual landscape that we're living in and that parents are raising kids in.
Very, very tricky. Andrew's got a question about eating disorders. Do you see any kind of link between the hyper prioritization of diets that you mentioned in high income families and eating disorders?
Yes, I think I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I think that is a part of the story. So I, in my research, did interviews with both parents and kids within the household. And so the goal of that was to also try to kind of track, some of these parenting approaches around food and square that with also how kids were talking about food and how kids thought about food. For a lot of the higher income moms who did the hyper prioritization of diet, I was really struck by how many of them were also aware of the fact that they did not want to trigger eating disorders in their children, and that they worried that because they cared so much about diet, that they might actually do that. And I think it's a really difficult line to walk. And again, it's a very stress inducing for mothers in particular. And one of the reasons is this: mothers really care about the nutritional quality of what their kids eat. Like they want their kids to eat fruits and vegetables and things. But a lot of those understandings of a healthy diet are also tied to understandings of having their kid be a healthy weight. And a lot of mothers I talked about felt like they were really walking this line where, of course, they cared about their kids' diets because they cared about them getting the vitamins and nutrients they need, but they also wanted their children to be within the right range of BMI. And part of the reason was that was something that mothers also felt really accountable for. Like when you go into a pediatrician's office, one of the first things that happens is your child is weighed and they tell you whether or not your kid is normal or not. And especially low income mothers felt really worried if their kids were going to be outside of that normal range. And so, some of the fixation on diet, like the reason that mothers cared so much about diet, was also tied to their desire for their kids to be seen as normal and healthy. And a lot of that, I think, has the potential to be triggering for eating disorders because it ties food to weight and to a sense of, it kind of requires a sense of control and a tight grip on diet. I met children who had eating disorders. I would like to, and actually part of my future research is to kind of track these kids over time and see what happens. But so I can't really comment on whether there's kind of that direct link between these approaches, but I'm interested to follow that up and to see kind of how those hyper prioritizing approaches may play out in these kids' lives later on.
Indeed, very interesting. And a couple of comments to follow up the point that you made earlier about the role of institutional responsibility in schools in particular. Susan just makes a comment here about your research being a good argument for universal meals in the United States, regardless of what you feel about quality, she says. And talking about the importance of those meeting nutritional and emotional needs. But there's also a follow-on question as well about school meals, which is relevant, which is from Matt, who says that he's cooking for his children at the moment, so he's missing some of the things that you're saying. But do lower income parents talk about different experiences in the school holidays when parents, particularly mothers, may need to work less and hence earn less to care for children, and children miss out on food provided by schools? Did that come up in the discourse at all?
Yeah, I mean, holidays definitely came up in conversations as times that were often more stressful because kids were out of school. And for low income families, they really depended on their kids getting some meals during the school day. And, when I would recruit families in food bank lines, and I would ask them about, what they were there for and what they were, just kind of what their experience was. And they often told me, like, I have to make sure to be able to cover my kids' food for the next 2 weeks. And so I need to make sure that I have enough. One thing that happened in the US again during the pandemic has actually been a very interesting time for nutrition policy because it's kind of created this opening for policies that used to seem politically impossible. But there was a program created called Pandemic EBT, which is basically during summer months, low-income families received money for groceries for their children to cover the cost of meals that would have otherwise been covered by school meals. And so I see that as a really exciting development and something that it's being proposed will continue for years to come. And I think that addresses this point that you've raised about the holidays and, just how important school meals are for addressing, I would say in particular, student hunger and food insecurity within families.
Yeah, Ernestina here wanted to share a Mexican experience, and she said that in her work, she observed that mums translate their anxieties, their stresses about healthy eating to their children, and their children then react by not eating the fruits and vegetables because they can feel this stress. But then when mothers went and left their children in school, the stress came off and children ate their meals happily in schools. So that's also another fascinating observation from Mexico. Onto a question here about from Antonio. Everybody is saying how fantastic your presentation is, by the way. Which
thank you.
True. He says there's two things: the cheap processed foods in low income and the raw kind of healthy home cook from high income, and both have a level of awareness but aren't able to cook, and pointing out how the health and emotional distortions are limited. And he's implying that this difference is what leads to overweight and obesity. And do you think that this way that low income and high income women, as you've interviewed, react differently to stresses, both emotional but differently, deprioritization, hyperprioritization? What is your observation about that, how that plays out, given that we know there are disparities in BMI?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a part of the story. And the way that I think about it as part of the story is that I think about these broader structural inequalities like economic inequality and racial inequality, and how that creates these very different worlds that parents are raising their children in. So you have parents like Brenda who are raising their children in these contexts of, extreme scarcity, I would say. And then you have parents like, Virginia on the other end of the spectrum who are raising their kids in contexts of incredible privilege and financial security. And so those inequalities create these really different worlds, and those worlds help create these really different emotional experiences for mothers. And as I alluded to at the end of the talk, I think that there's definitely an argument to be made to think about, like, how do these emotional experiences change on a broader scale how families are eating across income levels? And I don't want to extrapolate my research to say that I think that they're the driver of what's happening. It's not necessarily that, but I think they're a neglected part of the story, because for low-income moms, downscaling really was essential to be able to parent in a context where you don't have a lot to give your children, where there's so many economic stressors, and it's really just such a losing battle to try to get your kid to eat a healthy meal given everything going on. At the same time, downscaling really works to lower expectations and beliefs about what you can get your kids to eat. And those are a very rational response to these incredible hardships, but they also matter, because if low-income families don't believe that their kids can eat healthy food, that they as parents have the means to get their kids that nutritious meals, that's going to have impacts on their kids' diets too, and on families' diets. And similarly for higher income families, to the degree that those moms through upscaling feel compelled to do more and more and work harder and harder and get their kids better and better food, that's also going to have an impact on their kids' diets and what those diets look like. And so I think that these emotional experiences and inequalities are a part of the like broader conversation and story about obesity in America, about dietary and health inequalities.
Yeah, and I've been working in this field for 20 years now around obesity and other forms of poor nutrition, and I have to say, hearing you today, it's a sort of devastating critique on the academic community and the public health community that these kinds of issues are not raised more, and that very simplistic notions of what influences what people are eating are just the norm. Which play out very importantly in the policy space as well in terms of what's proposed. So I think the work is so important in showing this. A question about the research from Anna. She says, can I ask, what were the initial reactions of mothers or families when you approached them with the research questions?
Yeah, so I approached families and I did a couple of things to try to address some of the concerns that people might have about the research. So I think when you go and you tell someone, I want to talk about your diet or your nutrition, there's an instant feeling of judgment that can happen. Like, oh, okay, here's this researcher coming to evaluate the quality of my diet or how good or how healthy I eat. And so I really framed the study as being about food choices and how do families eat and how do parents make food choices and shop for food. And so I really tried to frame the study in a broader way and made it very also clear that I was a sociologist and not a nutritionist or a dietitian. And I think that framing went a really long way and actually helped me to recruit a diverse sample of families that had really different diets, because they didn't think I was someone coming in from the nutrition community or public health to offer them some prescriptive advice about how they should be eating or to critique their dietary habits. And then once I had recruited a family to the study, that's when I sat down with them, often at their home, and spent anywhere from 3 to 6 hours with them and their family. I did private interviews with parents. Often that was mothers, but I also conducted interviews with fathers when they were available. I conducted interviews with at least one child, but again, often more children if they were around. And so over the course of that time in families' households, I also had the opportunity to observe families. I often ate with families, and I got some of those ethnographic observations and insights that really informed the book, and that I see those methods as really responsible for also helping me learn these stories that I shared with you today.
And do you find, if I can just ask a quick follow-up, do you find it difficult to get funding for this kind of work relative to different types of research in this area?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Yes, I do. I do find it very difficult because, as you mentioned, I think there's a very narrow paradigm of what research on food and nutrition is supposed to be about, and the methods it's supposed to use, and how it's supposed to kind of approach these, or, think like epistemologically about these choices. And so I was lucky to receive a lot of funding from my institution when I was a graduate student to do the work, and have received like private foundation funding as well. But from institutes like the National Institutes of Health in the US, or the kind of these broader government institutes, I think that the methods that I use are not necessarily the most common methods in public health. And so they're a little bit different than I think how a lot of people approach these questions. But I think it's also why some of the insights I generate are a bit different than some of the insights that have been generated using often more like quantitative methods.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Sorry to give a plug for something that we've done at the Centre for Food Policy, but I don't know whether you've seen it, but we produced a brief last year, which is a review of all the methods that one can use in lived experience research around food. So led by my colleague Kimberly Neve. So I'll put the link into the chat for anyone who's interested in that. And that's part of our efforts as well, to try and advance what is seen as a legitimate source of knowledge in this area.
I love that. I will definitely check it out. And I was going to say that I actually think some of the best work that has informed my own methodological approach and just the insights on families across the income spectrum comes from the UK. When I was starting off in 2014 with this study, it was a lot of work that was coming out of out of England and Scotland that really helped me see the value of doing this kind of research. So I think that you are actually light years ahead of where we are in the US as far as valuing and utilizing these different methods.
Great, that's good to hear. I've got a question from Ryan here, and we spoke about social media earlier and about the need to support women and the gender inequalities and so on. And he says, any suggestions about how we can better craft messages in the media to help mothers rather than make them feel more guilt? And he's thinking about health and nutrition magazines and blogs and so on. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's, the nature of journalism and the media is that you need exciting, at times sensational headlines in order to attract readers. And I get that is is kind of how the industry operates. At the same time, and this is something that some folks that I work with in the nutrition community and I have talked a lot about, it can also generate this nutrition confusion where like every other year, the New York Times comes out with an article about like how coffee is good for you, and then it's bad for you, and then it's good for you. And like the same with butter, it's great for you, but then it's killing you. Like, and that I think is really does a disservice to everyone, but also to parents who are trying to make these really difficult choices. And so I think focusing more on, what we know in the nutrition community, there's actually a good amount of consensus about what a healthy diet is, and what food groups are included in that, and what in the broadest sense, what a nutritious meal is. And I think focusing a little bit more on those areas of consensus and talking about how, a healthy diet can be adapted across cultures and communities, and a focus on that I think would be really valuable, rather than kind of trying to upend common wisdom about different foods or different nutrients. I think that's interesting, but I don't think it serves families very well.
Yeah, and the basic science is just about there. So
yeah.
But Alicia's got a message, also a question about messaging, but this time messaging that comes across from the food world, I guess, people like me or nutritionists or who said, do you think the messages that come across from the food world contribute to the guilt feelings with women? Like you spoke about how particularly high income women think that they've got to have everything right, healthy, sustainable, cooking every night and so on. There seems to be a lot out there about what a woman should be doing, rather than capacity building and focusing on the art of the possible within the practicalities and realities of their lives.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I was just reading the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in the US, which is a big foundation that focuses on health research. They recently came out with something like 26 recommendations for like feeding your child a healthy diet. And I read through them and I thought they were really interesting, but also my reaction was like, gosh, that's a lot for any parent to try to manage, like that's a lot of recommendations to keep in mind, and a lot of ways to feel like you're not doing a great job. When I try to feed my toddler, I can maybe keep 3 recommendations in the top of my mind. So I do think that simplifying some of the messaging, talking about the fact that, I think it's a balance of, on the one hand, like we do have research about how to address kids' pickiness and how to, prepare, like we actually have great research on, healthy eating within families. At the same time, I think that the way that research is framed can be improved in a way that doesn't induce guilt or create a black and white picture, but rather creates a picture in shades of gray, and also acknowledges the barriers to healthy eating for families. Like, I think sometimes the way that we talk about how mothers should be feeding their kids completely ignores the reality that most mothers have full-time jobs, and also that mothers might not want to spend all of their free time cooking for their children. There's this, I think your point about the focus on what mothers should be doing is so it makes so many assumptions and so many normative judgments about what a good mom is. But the fact of the matter is that like some moms I met don't like cooking. They didn't want to cook. So how can we also create recommendations for mothers who have really different preferences around spending time in the kitchen? I think having a more open approach and a more realistic and grounded approach to these topics would be really beneficial. And I think it would resonate with more mothers across society.
Yeah, I was just talking with one of my colleagues yesterday about her study related, which is similar in some senses, and talking about the fact that some people just don't like cooking. And it's almost like we went to say they should like cooking. Like, is there something wrong with them if they don't like cooking? And in fact, it's okay. It's okay not to like cooking, but I don't think it gets treated like that. Patsy's got a question about whether you cover issues around infant feeding in your book and in your work. Clearly, breastfeeding and the way and feeding very young children is a source of enormous guilt and emotion among women. But she's asking the question about ending misleading marketing practices and all of the things that I need to do to protect women maternity provision in order to make it easier for women rather than just make them feel guilty.
Yeah, it's such an important topic. In my book, I don't talk about it a lot just because a lot of the families that I spent time with have older children. Mothers also talk to me about difficulties with breastfeeding and nursing, especially when they went back to work. And all of the topics that you've just listed in this Q&A really about these challenges really resonate with me. And I know there's so much important research on this, but it's not something that I covered as much in the book. And it wasn't as much a focus just because many of the mothers I met were like at least a decade removed from that experience.
Well, thank you. We've come to the end now of the time. There are other questions. There's questions from Seth about dads, which I think has been answered. There's questions about from Elizabeth, which covers the school meals point. There's questions about food allergies. There's I think most of it has been more or less covered. Forgive me for those who I didn't manage to get to. But I did just want to say from Amanda, who I'm sorry, Amanda, I didn't get to ask your question, but I'll just say what you said about that was an amazing insight and resonates with my experience and observations. And I have to say, just speaking both professionally and personally, for me as a mom and someone who's kind of just a person, just like so many of us, there were things that you said, it really kind of, it gets to you, it really kind of, it really makes you think just about your own experience. And I have to say, it makes you feel a bit less alone, I think, because it is challenging. And I wonder what would happen have you in fact gone and approached policymakers and talked directly to policymakers? I think there was a question about that from at the end. Is there what happens if you have you spoken to policymakers about this, and what kind of reaction did you get?
Yeah, well, I feel like my goal is with this book is to use it as a platform now to go speak with policymakers. Yeah. I've spoken with a lot of people who are working in like food equity and nutrition equity and food access at like local government levels. And I think there's an openness and an interest in it. I think, one of the points in my book, which I didn't talk about today, is that, we have spent a lot of time and money in the US focusing on geographic food access. And it turns out the story is far more complicated than food does. And so that's an insight that I think policymakers and they're interested in. But TBD on what they say. I will keep you all updated, but my hope is to be able to use some of this work and now that the book is finally out, to use it as a way to be able to bring this conversation to policymakers and share these stories and lived experiences with them in ways that might be useful to them in thinking about the policies that would actually improve families' lives.
Yeah, no, I think it is really important and can make a difference. And we have a community of practice at the centre about this kind of work. And one of our webinars was around how you talk to policymakers, which is one of our the points. And even though the research is not orthodox in terms of its use of evidence, the idea that you're telling these stories, and I think that's why you've had so much incredibly positive feedback in the Q&A and in the chat to your talk tonight, because you're telling people stories, but you're telling them in a very rigorous way, based on very deep reflection and analysis, rather than just telling a single story. Mm-hmm. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. Thank you so much for the brilliant questions that came in from our wonderful audience tonight. And thank you. And
yeah,
go and buy Priya's book. It sounds just wonderful. I can't wait to read it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the amazing questions. This was so great, and I'm so glad to have had the chance to share my work and discuss it with all of you.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone.